With today's sermon in our series, Exodus, Set Free to Follow God, here is Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
So we're up to the place in Exodus where we're nearing the end of the second and perhaps most significant act in the drama. The primary movement, of course, in Exodus is not the Exodus itself, although it's really important and it's particularly dramatic when the people are brought out of Egypt. That's not the centerpiece of the book. Part of that is indicated by the fact that all that drama takes place at the very beginning, really, and then we're into this section where the Lord enters into this relationship with his people. And it's this part of the book that is so significant and important to understand the impact and influence of Exodus throughout the Old Testament and into the New. And what we're up to now is kind of the end of, if I could put it this way, the marriage ceremony between God and his people, between the Lord and the people of Israel. So in chapter 19, when God brought them to the mountain, he reminded them of what he had done in Egypt and invited them into a relationship with him. It was kind of the proposal, chapter 19, verses 1 to 8. And then immediately after the people said, yes, we would like to enter into that relationship with you, we kind of jump into the ceremony itself. There's this 3-day pause as the people prepare themselves. The Lord comes down onto the mountain. There's the 10 commandments that are given, and then the additional laws, which I'll make some comment about in a moment, followed by God's statement about what he would do. It's kind of the vows part, right? It's where the people are told what they will do as faithful members of this relationship, and then God responds with what he will do. And the fact that God does all the talking reminds us that the wedding analogy is not entirely perfect. This is not a relationship between two equals, right? You know, you go to a wedding these days and the groom says his promises and then the promises are stated by the bride and they're basically the same promises with a different name at the start, right? It's a relationship between equals. This is not. This is a relationship between the Lord, the creator of all things, and the people of Israel. And so it's the Lord who tells them these are the expectations for you, right? The expectations of what it looks like to live in relationship with me. And furthermore, he then tells them what he will do. And again, I'll come back to both of those dynamics because I think they're quite important for us. But then after that, in the passage that we're looking at in chapter 24, we have the equivalent of the giving and receiving of rings and the reception, right? So there's some symbolic actions in all of this. It's at the very conclusion of this, when Moses comes to the people in verse 3, he told them the Lord's words and laws, and they responded with one voice. This is their I do, or we do, right? Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses writes all that down. The next day, builds an altar, and there's sacrifices made, and there's this strange little interaction between Moses and the people, which includes sprinkling blood on them, which is not normally what happens at weddings, right? So again, the analogy is not quite perfect. But what's taking place here is this symbolic action. So in the ancient Near East, when covenants were made between groups of people in particular, they often included these symbolic actions to try to make sense of how important this was. This is kind of like the "till death do us part" bit of marriage vows, but with an edge. So what seems to have happened in the ancient world is that they would make the covenant between these two groups of people. They would both kind of state their expectations of one another, and then animals would be sacrificed, in part for the festival that would follow, the celebration dinner, but in part to essentially say, if we are not faithful to these expectations, may we become like these animals, right? If we don't live up to this, may we, well, die. That's how serious the relationship was. And so when Moses sprinkles the blood on the people, he's saying this is the blood that symbolizes what will happen if you do not fulfill these obligations. This is not something to be entered into lightly. This is a really serious and significant moment in your history. And right after he does that, reads the book of the covenant to them, and they respond in verse 7, "We will do everything the Lord has said, we will obey." And then there's the reception, right? The people of Israel send their elders along with Moses and Aaron and his 2 sons, and they have lunch with God, right? We said that we're told that they see God or see a representation of him in some way, shape, or form. And what's so remarkable is that God doesn't raise his hand against them. He doesn't strike them down. They're in the presence of the Lord. They're eating and drinking. It's just a remarkable phrase, isn't it? It's just kind of this offhanded comment. Oh, and they ate and drank before the Lord, just as you do. And I wonder what the meal was like. You know, when you want to be careful that you don't use the wrong fork, when you're having dinner with God. I don't know how that works, but I suspect that there would have been some celebration because they have entered into this remarkable, remarkable relationship with God. This covenant relationship. And to the reader of Exodus, this is the part where you kind of go, wow. Yes, it was wow when God rescued them at the shores of the Red Sea, but this is really wow. And in fact, it leads into the final section of the book of Exodus, where God basically says, I'm going to dwell with you. I'm going to live with you. I'm not just going to remain at a distance, but I'm going to have you create a tabernacle, and I'm going to dwell there right in the middle of the camp with you, and I will always be with you. It's just this remarkable extension of this covenant relationship that they establish here. Now, a wedding analogy kind of works. There's lots of places where it helps us understand what's happening. There's some places where it doesn't quite make sense for us. And I think I want to return again to the expectations piece. Both the expectations that God has for his people, but also the expectations that his people can have of God. And I want to return there because I think we tend to trip up a little bit when we both think about what we are to do and what God says he will do. And we trip up because we forget a really significant dynamic in relationships. That dynamic is that relationships are meant to be mutually beneficial, aren't they? We enter into relationships with one another for mutual benefit, right? Now, that might be the relationship between a contractor and myself, right? The benefit is they receive money and work, and the benefit for me is that I get a new bathroom or a new deck or whatever it might be. It might be the relationship we enter into in our workplaces, where again, there is mutual benefit. I get to use my skills and abilities and get paid for it. And the company or the organization or the school, right, they benefit because they're able to fulfill the needs of their customers, or they're able to teach students, or whatever it might be. And relationships, when they become more intimate, right, our deep friendships or our relationships between a husband and a wife are also meant to be mutually beneficial. And while the relationship with God is unique, there is still meant to be some kind of a benefit here. And we sometimes just think about the benefit to us and forget about the benefit to the Lord. And we have to use the word benefit a little bit carefully here, because how much can we really give to God, right? But I want to kind of come back to this by having a look at both the laws and the statements that God makes about what he will do. Because I think, as I said, we tend to trip up over a really important interaction within them. So we've had a look at the Ten Commandments and the laws that are followed, that follow it in chapter 19, verse 22, all the way through to chapter 23, verse 19, kind of add to our overall picture of what it looks like for the people of Israel to be in relationship with God. And we don't have time to kind of go through all of those, but let me draw your attention to two really important features of those laws, and in fact, all the sections of law that you'll find in the Old Testament. The first thing to note is that those laws impact every area of life. So the laws that the Lord gives are not just the laws to regulate their relationship with Him, right? This is how you worship me properly. This is how you should respond to me and pray for me and pray to me and all that kind of stuff. There's also elements of the relationship with God that impact how we interact with one another, right? It's like a marriage, right? You don't agree to be married kind of from Wednesday afternoons till Thursday mornings, right? Once you're married, every part of your life is shaped by that relationship. Even though you might go to work on your own, right? You're still married, right? And you can't kind of leave that to one side. And so every area of life is incorporated into the relationship with God. And the second thing to note, just in passing, is that one of the key indicators of someone or a group of someones who are in relationship with the Lord is their commitment to justice. It's one of the things that's woven all the way through those laws, sometimes stated very, very explicitly. How we treat those around us is a really important indicator of our relationship with the Lord. So that's the one thing. And we tend to, we tend to trip up a little bit on the law because we end up treating it as something that is only to be obeyed, as if that is the only purpose of the law. Now, we have to be careful here, don't we? Because the law is to be obeyed, isn't it? The Lord is worthy of us listening to His description of what life looks like when we live it in relationship with Him. It is worth us taking the time to consider and to think through what it means to be obedient, to listen to God, to pay attention and then do what He says, what He suggests, right, in terms of living our lives. But that's not the entire purpose of the law. But if we assume that it is, then the law very quickly becomes a list of demands that not only becomes a list of demands that becomes a kind of a burden for us, but it also fosters and gives birth to legalism pretty quickly. Because once I have my list of what it looks like in terms of physical reality for people to follow after God, I can then hold my list up to you and find out whether you're the right sort of people. Right? I can hold my list up and compare. I can see what you do and look at my list and go, you're close. And that's not the full intention of the law, is it? The law has a deeper purpose, a more significant function beyond only being obeyed. Obedience has a higher purpose itself. I'll come back to that. But in chapter 23, starting in verse 20, the passage just before the confirmation of the covenant, we actually find that God lists for His people the things that He will do for them, the benefits for them. And there's a couple, one at the beginning and one at the end, that aren't stated, but I think are helpful to recognize. The first is that God will provide for His people. And that provision has already been exhibited in His provision of food and of water in particular, but also it is indicated and demonstrated in His provision of the law, giving the people the boundaries within which they can live a full, good life. The other one at the very end, which is kind of implied in what happens, is that God's presence will be with them. They have access to God's presence. God is not going to be distant and far off. The elders eat dinner with Him, and then they're going to build a tabernacle so God can live within them. Those are kind of the bookends of this, the provision and the access to His presence. But beginning in chapter 23, verse 20, we have a list of the things that God will do. He says, "See, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared." His presence and protection is one of the things the people can expect that God will provide for them. If you skip down to verse 25, "Worship the Lord your God, and His blessing will be on your food and water. I will take away sickness from among you, and none will miscarry or be barren in your land. I will give you a full lifespan." Now, the evidence of God's relationship with His people will be seen in the fullness of their physical lives. He goes on in verse 27, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. This is what I've termed the divine intimidation of their enemies, right? No one's going to bother you because the Lord is with you and is going to make your paths straight. He goes on in verse 29 to say, I will not drive out these nations in a single year because the land will become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little, I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land, which is an example of divine wisdom, that God will provide for them perfect timing in terms of the conquest of the land itself. And then finally, the divine establishment of their boundaries. Verse 31, I will establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and from the desert to the Euphrates River. I will give into your hands the people who live in the land, and you will drive them out. He also, though, provides them with spiritual boundaries. Do not make a covenant with those people, and do not worship their gods. All of these things are what God promises his people. And you can see why we trip up over the law when we make it something that is only to be obeyed. But do you see how we can trip up on these promises as well? Because the reality is, of course, that this is not always what it looks like to follow after God, does it? You ever struggle with this question of why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people? Well, it's right here, isn't it? These are challenging verses for us because it suggests that evangelism should be the simplest thing in the world, right? Because how it should work is everyone who is not faithful to God should have a rubbish life. They won't live very long. They'll be sick all the time. Life will be difficult. But for everyone who follows God, it'll be smooth sailing. And how hard is it to connect the dots on that? We shouldn't even have to say to anybody, know the Lord. They'll just look at our lives and go, why does everything you touch turn to gold? And we'll go, well, because I'm following Jesus. And they're like, oh, can I please? Right? Does that happen to everybody? See, and we trip up over this, and we end up solving it in one of two primary ways. The one is we push it into the future, right? And we say, oh yes, well, life now will be difficult, but in heaven, it'll be great. When it's just the good people left, then the only people who good things can happen to will be good people. All the bad stuff will be done, and we'll be fine. It's just talking about heaven. The problem, of course, is that God is not talking about heaven in Exodus 24, is he? He's talking about here and now. So that's one response. We push it into the future. Or we pull it all into our present and say that, in fact, in reality, every single one of us who follows God ought to be living the complete full life, and that nothing bad should ever happen to us. And if it does, there's an enormous problem. So the one solution pushes it so into the future that it has no relevance in our life today. And the other solution isn't a solution at all because it can't handle when anything bad happens. It has no answer for suffering. And when you consider the life of Jesus, who is perfectly aligned with the will of God and suffered, any theology that cannot handle suffering is not a Christian theology. It's as simple as that. But it still leaves us with the problem that we trip up over this, right? So we end up at this, the centerpiece of the book of Exodus, the very heart of what the book is about, this relationship between the Lord and his people, which is the basis of our relationship with the Lord through Christ. And we're left with a law that we so often reduce to a list of things to do and a bunch of promises for a good life that we tend to either ignore or make into an immediate promise that must take place. And you wonder why we just kind of go, yeah, I don't know about the Old Testament. I like the Psalms. They talk about my life, right? They're good. And Jesus, I like Jesus. And Paul, he's got some good, but the Old Testament we tend to leave a little bit behind. And this is where I think I want to come back to this idea that relationships are meant to be mutually beneficial. That there is a benefit to the Lord in this relationship that he has with the people of Israel. Now, I use the word benefit lightly, right? I don't want to suggest that God somehow needs us in some sort of horribly desperate way, that he is not complete in and of himself. You follow me on this one? But there is nonetheless a benefit found in the purpose of this relationship. Because this relationship that God establishes with the people of Israel was not just to give them a wonderful life. That wasn't the purpose. God did not say in chapter 19, you've seen what I did to Egypt, and now if you will be faithful to me, I'll make your life sweet. What did he invite them into? If you will be faithful to me, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, set apart and participating in the promise I made to Abraham that I will bless all nations through you. The purpose of this covenant relationship and the purpose of our relationship with God in Christ has been to participate with him in the renewal and restoration of everything. That's what God wants. And all of a sudden, the law and the issue of suffering actually have a slightly different answer, don't they? Because if the purpose of my relationship with God, of our relationship with God, is to be part of his restoration and renewal, then the law is an example of what it looks like to live in relationship with God in a busted and broken world. Because you know what else the law assumes? It assumes the presence of sin, doesn't it? The law assumes that the world is busted and broken, that people will be killed, and that there will be theft, and that there will be adultery, and that there will be all the evidence of brokenness. And the law is given not just to beat people into shape, but hopefully as we respond faithfully, and faithfulness is such a better term to use, really. It's about faithfulness. It's about faithfulness. And if we are faithful, then we are demonstrating to the world what it looks like to live in a broken world in relationship with God. And that plays into his purpose, doesn't it? Because now what we are is we are evidence of how you can live in a world that's busted, in a world that's broken, in a world that needs repair and redemption and renewal. And likewise, it makes some sense of that whole dilemma about whether we should expect all the good things now or whether we should expect all the good things later. Because the purpose of our relationship wasn't that we get the good things. The purpose of our relationship with God was so that the world might enter into relationship with God. Which makes some sense of Jesus then, doesn't it? If I can just jump right to him. It makes some sense of Jesus because Jesus suffered, and he wasn't particularly wealthy, and he was influential in kind of all the wrong ways. And yet, he was perfectly aligned with the will of the Father. And what was the will of the Father expressed in Jesus? To restore and renew the world. Jesus was not sent to be an example of triumphant, victorious living in every sphere of life. Jesus came to redeem the world. And the purpose for the people of Israel was to enter into that same purpose. And therefore, the questions of the law become not just a matter of things to do and things to obey and lists to make. Instead, they become the expression of a heart that seeks to trust God and be faithful to him in the midst of the brokenness, knowing that they have been set apart to participate with God's plans to bring that restoration. Do you see why the story of Exodus is so critical to understanding the Old Testament, but also making sense of Jesus? Moses sprinkles the blood on the people. And on the night he was betrayed, Jesus took the cup and said, almost the same words, "This is the blood of the covenant, but not the blood of animals, my blood." Inviting right then his disciples to enter into that same relationship. Is it any wonder that the elders of Israel celebrated and had a meal before God? Because I don't think it was a somber affair. This was a remarkable moment in history. as the Lord partners with and covenants himself to a people in order that his purposes might come to pass. And those same purposes exist today, drive our relationship today, motivate our desire to be faithful today.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
Remembering the purpose of our relationship with God unlocks for us, I think, a deeper and more profound understanding of the purpose of the law and also the role of suffering and hardship in our lives. Our purpose is not to have the perfect life or to tick all the boxes, but to be faithful to God as a demonstration of what it looks like to live in relationship with Him and to participate as He restores the world in Christ Jesus. Such an exciting relationship. I trust this week that you will live in that excitement and joy. We hope to see you again soon. God bless.